Hey mathematicians, as you've already seen in some previous videos, the main idea when you're trying to solve an equation is getting the variable all by itself, which means that you need to get rid of whatever is there hanging out with the variable, right? And that means that you need to recognize what is it exactly that is the operation that's with a variable. And addition and subtraction, for example, have a tendency to be pretty easy for us to recognize. Not all of us, of course, but most of us have can see, all right, in this first example, x plus 2 means that we're adding 2 to the variable, which means we're going to do the opposite of adding 2, which is subtracting 2. And you know from previous videos that you need to do that onto both sides. Most of us have a fairly easy time recognizing subtraction as well. Usually it's pretty easy to identify. There are some tricky ones that have to do with subtraction that we'll talk about at a later date, but for now we'll focus on the basics. And so we can see here that x minus 4 implies that you are subtracting, which means you need to cancel out that subtraction by adding 4 to both sides. So those two, most people have a fairly easy, time representing, but multiplication and division can be a little bit of a tough spot for us to recognize. And I'm going to start with the one that I think is the hardest, which is multiplication. And the reason, in my opinion, this is the trickiest one is because we've invented so many ways to represent multiplication, all different ways of saying exactly the same thing. So 3 times x equals 45 is what I'm going to write, but I'm going to write it in several different ways. But the idea is that even though I'm doing it several different ways, it all means exactly the same thing. It's just a different way of saying 3 times x equals 45. So first of all, in your younger grades, you of course used something like this to represent multiplication in the past, right? 3 times x. Now that we're in algebra, we really want to stay away from that though because we're using variables, so we don't want to use the x to represent multiplication anymore. So here are some ways that we can represent 3 times x equals 45. One way, instead of using the x, is that we use a dot to represent multiplication. So this is one way of saying 3 times x equals 45. Another way is just by putting the variable and the number right next to each other. So if you see 3 sitting next to the x right there with nothing in between them, that also means multiplication. And another way that is common is by putting the numbers or the variable that you're multiplying together next to each other in parentheses as well. So these are the 3 most common ways that we represent multiplication in algebra, so that you can keep an eye out on those 3 different methods. And so, of course, multiplication is going to be canceled out with division. So if you see an equation that looks anything like these, you know that that is multiplication, and you're going to need to cancel it out by doing division. And speaking of division, it helps to give you a quick little review about division as well. Kind of the same way that we did with multiplication, where we've changed the rules on you as you've gotten older, we're doing the same thing with division as well. You used to be using this little, division symbol that you used all through grade school, and then a lot of the time you do use it in middle school as well. But now that we are in algebra, we almost never use that symbol to represent division anymore. Instead, we represent it using a fraction bar. So here are a couple of different ways, really quickly. I'll show you a couple of examples. So I'm going to represent x divided by 3 equals 17, and we're going to do that with x, and instead of the division symbol, we are going to use a fraction bar. So this means x divided by 3 equals 17. Exactly the same thing as saying x divided by 3 equals 17. It's just that the fraction bar way is the way that we represent it in algebra.